So last weekend, I rented the Canon EF 100-400mm IS II and took it out for 4 days straight at my local trail system. There, I captured squirrels, herons, as well as nesting tree swallows and a white-tailed deer, which will show up later in the video. Hope you enjoy. Oh, I've turned on the GoPro.
And the detection. Oh, it does not see the eye at all.
If only you had better autofocus. No, I'm kidding. It's kind of a bad photo though, yeah.
Yeah, I just go on top of the feeder.
Yeah, not the greatest. It's still a squirrel though. Where are the birds? Bro. Oh, ducks! Oh. I had to bump my ISO up here. Oh.
No, it's an auto.
Oh, chipmunk. Oops, that was not meant to be a photo taken there. Cool. Hey Eric, guess what?
What?
We're going back into the shade, which means more mosquitoes.
Oh, no.
There's a bird there.
Get off, please.
Some sort of small sparrow, it looks like. Yeah, it's a small sparrow.
I don't even see what you're looking at.
No, I got a photo of it, like, calling.
W.
I think it's just a song sparrow, but oh what are they looking at? What are they recording? Oh, there is, yeah. Hey, it's pretty cool. I mean, maybe it's the same one, I don't know. Oh, is it? That's cool. What?
There's a deer.
Yo, serious? Is it still there?
Go down the path, turn left.
Okay, okay, I'm on the way. It's going away from us though. Yeah. Frick. Didn't do that for long. Can't see its face. Oh, there we go. Might be. I don't really care to know, to be honest. I don't care to know. It might be actually, yeah. We can just check ourselves when we're back. Oh, it's you again. That's what I wanted. Come on the eye. Not really, on the eye. Let's go back to the trail. Let's go back towards the trail. Kinda. Oh shoot, my tripod in the background ruins the shot. See that little bluebird? Tripod. Oops. That might, is that the money shot? Maybe it is. So now that I'm back at home, it's time to edit through some of these photos. The first picture is of a beautiful song sparrow singing its heart out. So I first like to go to make some basic adjustments to the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. I left the highlights as they were because they were pretty flat in this photo and didn't really need many changes. For the shadows, I lowered them as well as the blacks just because I wanted the sparrow and the branch it was sitting on to stand out more against the background. Lastly, I increased the whites just to give the image a bit more of a bright pop and sort of more of a contrasty look. I also added some texture and clarity just because that gives the image a bit more polish. However, I recommend against doing this in the case where your image is really noisy because it will only increase the artifacts more. So moving on to the tone curve, I want to add a bit more contrast to the image. I put 3 points along the basic curve just to, I guess, have the foundations for an S curve, which is where we're basically increasing the whites, as you can see, to give a bit more contrast and brightness to the image. I'm also lowering the highlights slightly. I like to do this in nature photos because it makes sure the whites aren't overbearingly bright and doesn't peak. I leave these sort of center points as is just because I feel that the overall balance is good so far between the lights and the darks. And then I also lower the blacks to give a bit more contrast and presence, as well as I guess move these shadows a bit more to the left and up, because that is able to crush the blacks while simultaneously adding fade, which is something that I personally like for my wildlife photos. So now that we're done with the basic adjustment, I like to move on to color grading. And so here I'm playing around with the overall temperature and tint of the image. However, I felt that it was quite good where it was and left it as is. I then like to go through the color sort of HSL tabs and sort of play around with that to determine what I generally want the end color grade of my image to be. When I'm color grading, I like to firstly focus on the actual subject. In this case, the sparrow itself, I like to increase the orange saturation as well as the orange luminance because it really helps to bring out the colors and sort of sharpness on that subject and make it really pop. For the yellows and greens, these tabs and these colors really affect the sort of leaves or grass in your photo. And so recently I've noticed in my editing, I've been trending towards having more orange yellows as well as more aqua greens. I think it creates this really cool duotone dynamic that really brings out the richness in the images. For blues, I just play around with it a bit, but really because the sky isn't that visible in this image, you're not really going to get much change out of the blues. And that's really it for color grading. I try to keep it very simple because the photo itself is already good as is. So quick disclaimer, I'm a sucker for vignetting, and so I add a decent amount here, -20, because I feel that it really draws the viewer into the image and into that focal point of the bird. I also go into these sort of radio filters and drop a radio filter over the song sparrow, because the fact that I can add a bit of exposure, usually 0.2 or 0.3 will do, and that really helps to give more of a sort of focus and really brighten up that focal point, because our eyes are drawn to the brightest parts of our photos. I also do an inverted mask with a negative exposure to give a more slight and natural looking vignette, just to once again go back to the idea of focus and focal points and the overall subject. Now, because the light is coming in from the left to the right, I add a linear gradient and increase sort of the highlights as well as slight increases to temperatures and tint. And I do that to simulate the idea of sunlight, because I want this image and the sort of vision I had was, first light, this bird, sort of early bird singing out its song, waking up the rest of the world. And I felt that doing this really helped to accentuate that. Now, because I add this sort of brightness and sort of this gradient on the left side, I do the opposite on the right side. I do the sort of same diagonal gradient, however, decrease the exposure because I think it once again restores balance to the image and makes it so that you're sort of really drawn in from the left of the image into the right side of the image, which is what I'm going for. And with that, that's really all there is to this image. I don't really add sharpening or detail because of the fact that this image is sharp enough as is. And yeah, that's sort of my workflow and sort of how I tackled editing this image. Moving along to the second image, this is probably my favorite picture that I got of that white-tailed deer, and I really want to give a sort of mysterious and dark feeling, like a predator stalking its prey. Similarly to the last image, I start off with some basic lighting stuff, so I do some slight exposure corrections, and then lower the highlights a little bit and add a bit more white to once again give the image that slight bit more contrast in the brighter areas. I lower the shadows and lower the blacks because I once again want more of a dark and brooding feeling to the image, right? More of this idea of a predator stalking its prey. I then increase texture and clarity a bit more just to give more of that polished feeling. So as I work through the tone curve, you might notice that I actually go through pretty much the exact same process as the previous image, and I will really do this exact same tone curve with minor tweaks for like 90 95% of my wildlife images. So same idea, raise the whites, lower the highlights to give it more of a contrasty but not over the top feeling, and then actually raise the blacks slightly to give it more of a faded feeling, and same thing, I crush the shadows while raising it to give more of a faded look, which goes once again with my sort of moody feeling. So as far as white balance go, I decided to play around with the temperature, and I end up raising it a little bit because I want to really accentuate the oranges on the deer's face. And then for color grading with the greens, I decided to give more of a aqua look to the greens while sort of lowering the saturation, and that really gives a sort of dark and rich tone to the green. Same idea with the yellows as before. I give it a very ever so slightly orange tint while giving it slight saturation to give it once again more of that sort of dual tone dichotomy. With the oranges, I make the deer a bit more red, which is sort of what I'm going for, and then also increase the saturation on it to make it stand out and pop a little bit more amongst the leaves. So here I'm doing the exact same vignetting trick where I'm basically adding a radial filter over the eye and sort of general face of the deer and adding exposure to that while having an identical filter over top of it. However, in that one it's inverted and decreasing exposure once again to add more of that natural looking vignette and that natural focal point within the image. Now as you can see, the filter doesn't actually darken the rest of the image a whole lot. It only adds a very slight amount, which is why I go back into the effects tab and add more vignetting to make the edges a bit more intense and a bit more darkened. I notice a lot of photographers like to play around with the camera calibration tab before they touch the HSL and color tab. However, I'm actually the exact opposite. I like to do it afterwards, and I think that's because generally, as far as my philosophy goes towards the camera calibration tab, it makes such big changes oftentimes that I'd rather it just refine my edit rather than define it. As you can see there, I just make changes to the red and green, I guess primary colors, and that's what it does. I also decided to go back to the HSL tab and do some ever so, I guess, slight refinements just to really land on that final color grade and final look I really want for this image. So as we approach the end of this edit, I felt that there just wasn't enough vignetting and enough darkness in the image, and so I lowered the vignetting amount as well as had more of a midpoint on the deer's eye, which I think once again really helped accentuate the focus on this central subject while more or less blacking out everything else. And so I also went through and just with a brush and just sort of did some corrections on the deer's face. I removed that one splinter, as you can see right here, as well as what looks like a blemish on the deer's face. I normally wouldn't do this to images, however, because this is more of a creative and artistic edit, I felt that it would just generally overall benefit the look of the picture. Despite all of my efforts up until this point, I felt that the image just wasn't dark enough still. So I added a radial or a linear filter on the left because I felt that would really darken the foliage while also darkening the deer's left eye and the left side of its face. And also added one on the bottom right to sort of get that half of the image as well without interrupting the face of the deer too much. And lastly, I also just noticed that the bottom leaf directly underneath the deer's eye was just still too bright. So I added one final linear gradient, and that just really, I think, brought together and really tied the overall dark and brooding feeling I was going for. Lastly, I just felt that the leaves were still just a bit off, so I played around a bit more with the green HSL tab until I landed on something that I really, I guess, liked and felt really fit for the image. Thank you all so much for watching. Hopefully I taught you something new or inspired you to give wildlife photography a try. Till next time.